Hajar, we often talk about African music, African art, African way of doing things. What do you think of an African democracy?
That's not the question I expected. What would that mean?
So that would mean a democracy adapted to African realities, African culture, and history.
I think that makes sense. There could be an argument for adopting democratic principles to the realities of Africa, I guess.
Well, I know an author who would tell you that democracy doesn't come in versions.
Now that I want to hear more about. Welcome to Threads of Africa, a space where African voices, books, and ideas come alive. Each episode, we open the pages of books, narrations, and oral traditions that carry the rhythms, struggles, and dreams of the continent. I'm Hajar.
And I'm Hamdan.
And together we're weaving a richer understanding of Africa, one thread at a time.
I had to think twice before choosing today's book. I actually read it back in September, and when I finished it, I wasn't sure what to make of it because, first, unlike the authors we have been talking about so far on this podcast, who are already well established and whose work has been widely read and critiqued, this book feels different.
Mm-hmm.
It's the author's first book, and second, to me, it felt in some ways like an incomplete work, or at least a book whose full meaning would perhaps emerge more clearly as the author explains his thinking in interviews or public conversations. So I hesitated, and I didn't know whether to talk about it now or wait, because the book came out this year. But the topic has only become more urgent in the months since I read the book. West Africa has been shaken by two coups, one in Guinea-Bissau and more recently a failed coup attempt in Benin. So suddenly the questions raised in this book felt not only pertinent but immediate and intertwined into the political atmosphere that concerns me and many more Africans.
Yep. So I would say in our holiday special in this episode, we are talking about a topic which is very much of actuality.
Yeah. So today's episode is dedicated to l'Afrique contre la démocratie, mythe, déni et péril. In English, Africa against democracy, myth, denial, and peril. It's a provocative and timely book by Senegalese journalist and now writer Ousmane Ndiaye, and it challenges us to confront the narratives some people hold about democracy on the continent. People who defend who defend democracy, some people who reject it, and at the moment when these debates are no longer abstract but unfolding across the region in real time, I felt like this is an important book to talk about. So the book is structured around 3 chapters, and I think we'll also structure today's episode around these chapters. Each chapter is directly tied to the title. The first chapter looks at the myth surrounding democracy in Africa. The second explores the denial of democracy, the ways in which some actors on the continent reject or dismiss democracy altogether. And the final chapter focuses on what Ousmane Ndiaye calls le péril. So the French word péril carries a strong sense of imminent danger, of a risk, and potentially irreversible path.
Mm-hmm.
It's about, I would say, the perilous adventure that unfolds when myths and denial shape how democracy is understood and practiced across the African continent. And
That sounds very serious.
yeah.
Very serious.
Yes. And it's, I think the book is an essay. It's worth saying that. So before we move on, it's I would like to say that it's actually the third essay we are discussing on the podcast.
Yeah.
And it, in many ways, I think it complements the first two. The one by Axelle Kabou, Africa Refusing the Development.
Yeah.
And Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o, Decolonizing the Minds, where he reflects on the politics of language in Africa.
Yeah. So I mean, as a recap, Axelle Kabou's book was talking about economic development and why it's not happening in Africa, and Biwa Thiong'o's book is talking about language and education and literature. And I think our third essay in this series will be focusing on democracy and politics. So yeah, it's a complete collection of very relevant topics to the events happening on the continent.
Yes, exactly. So now let me tell you a bit more about the author. To be completely frank, I would say that I don't know very much about him, and that's probably linked to the fact that he's just starting his writing journey. So what I will be sharing here about him is purely based on publicly available information. I first knew him as a journalist working with the French news channel TV5 Monde. And yeah, before becoming a writer, he was a journalist there. And that background, I would say, clearly shows in the way he approaches these topics. From what I could find, his LinkedIn profile indicates that he studied journalism at Université Cheikh Anta Diop in Dakar, Senegal, and later at the Institut Français de Presse. And yeah, that's about all I can tell you about today's author.
Yeah.
Now, the first chapter, the first theme, if you want, as I mentioned earlier, focuses on the myth surrounding democracy in Africa. And the first myth Ndiaye attacks is the idea that Africa is not ready or not yet ripe for democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And to that, he responds with a famous line by Nigerian Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka, who once interjected this statement, and I'm quoting here. He said, "Was Africa ever ready for dictatorship?" And that's more or less the approach Ousmane Ndiaye takes throughout this chapter. You know, in maths and formal logic, this kind of reasoning, I know the term in French it's called raisonnement par l'absurde, and I have searched this on Google. In Latin, it's called reductio ad absurdum, or in English, reduction to absurdity. So basically, you start by exposing what you see as a false premise. For example, in this case, the false premise is Africa is not ready for democracy. And then you show that if we accept that logic, it leads to an absurd or unjustifiable conclusion. And in this case, that would be Africa was never ready for dictatorship.
Yeah, I mean, that refreshes my mind around math classes. So yeah, I remember we used to follow that methodology. So basically, if you want to prove that the statement A is true, you start by assuming that A bar, or basically the opposite of A, is true, and you demonstrate that it leads to a false statement or outcome, and that's how you conclude that A can only be true. And this is basically the logic that the
Yeah.
author is following here.
Well, thank you for transforming this into a more complex equation. Now,
Yeah.
the reason why I'm explaining this is because this kind of reasoning can work very well in mathematics. Political and social debates are rarely black and white, and this is where my main critique of his approach lies. In the next section of the chapter, he goes on to criticize several Francophone African figures who have indeed argued that Africa is not ready for democracy. He focuses on figures who may not be very well known outside of Francophone circles. People like the Cameroonian journalist Alain Foucault, he used to be French, but now he's Beninese. He's Beninese. He's an activist, and he's called Kemi Seba. And there is also the Swiss Cameroonian activist Nathalie Yamp.
Yeah. I mean, I talked about the mathematical reasoning, but now focusing more on the content, I think, to be honest, the problem is not well defined, and therefore I think the argument is a bit fallacious. So basically, following the mathematical, reasoning or argument as you describe it, assumes determinism and binarity, as if the word is black and white. Basically, we talked about A and A bar, and basically this assumes that only these two states exist, and here A in this case is equal democracy, and A bar or non-A is equal dictatorship. And I think this representation is very limited or very limiting of reality, because I think there is a spectrum between A and A bar, between democracy and dictatorship, and also what is the definition of democracy, right? I mean, if you think about it in the Western sense, that is one way of applying democracy, but there could be other interpretations or other possibilities that can happen
Other definitions. No, but I think what you're saying is interesting, but hold on to that thought. I will come back to that.
Yeah.
And maybe first let me give some background information about the figures he criticized and why. And let me choose one of them, Alain Foucault, who is arguably the most well-known and widely respected among them. So Alain Foucault is a Cameroonian journalist, very well known, at least in Francophone West and Central Africa. He worked for Radio France Internationale, RFI, for about 31 years. And after more than 3 decades at RFI, he resigned and went on to create his own platforms on social media. And through these channels, he began openly criticizing the role of France and more broadly the West in Africa, their role in Africa's development and underdevelopment, arguing that they bear the large share of responsibility for the continent's current situation. So because he was already a well-established media figure, these positions quickly gained visibility and traction. And in the book, Ndiaye is highly critical of this turn. He characterizes Foucault's discourse as a populist and a populist discourse, and he argues that it departs from what he considers rigorous, responsible journalism. So, Ndiaye argues that figures like Alain Foucault and company, Kemi Siba, and although I think they're not doing the same things, he argues that they rely on populism, or what he calls a discourse of democratic relativism, a way of equating democracy with the West, and therefore presenting it as something foreign or imposed and ill-adapted to African realities. So one of his core arguments is that democracy has nothing to do with colonialism, and on the contrary, he shows that colonialism is fundamentally anti-democratic, and that democratic principles are universal, not Western, not African, but simply human.
Universal, yeah. I mean,
Universal,
as you said, yeah.
So he also strongly rejects the idea that there should be something like an African democracy. For him, this too is a kind of myth. Remember, he argues democracy is universal and therefore cannot be African, cannot be Western, or anything else. And to support this, he brings up a historical example from the late 18th century, something called the Republic of Lebu, founded around 1790 in what is now Dakar, Senegal. I don't want to spoil the entire story here, but what began as a revolt eventually led to the establishment of a democratic system. And he argues that traces of this system still survive today in Dakar, Senegal, where the leader, so-called the Serine, now plays a symbolic role within Senegal's modern democratic framework. Now, here's where I want to pause and offer a critique of his work. While these arguments are interesting, again, things I think are not that simple. This was a very specific historical and social setting. What was the size of the Republic of Lebu back then? What was the population? What were the livelihoods? What were the power structures at the time? All of these factors, I think, matter deeply when it comes to whether a democratic system works or not. And these are the questions that I would have for him if I was to sit with him. And just because something worked in a particular context centuries ago does not mean it can be transposed wholesale into today's world, especially in a globalized, hyper-connected, and economically unequal system. So I don't think it's particularly helpful to prevent people from thinking about new governance models adapted to the current realities simply because democratic principles are universal or because there were historical precedents. So in fact, I think at this point I can use his own approach and bring up counterexamples. The example that I'm thinking of is that certain African societies could be described as feudal, and that to some extent, I think these societies stand in tension with democratic principles. I think Africa has indeed known forms of governance that were hierarchical, built around land, lineage, loyalty, and personal allegiance. And in that sense, they can be described as feudal or proto-feudal systems. And here, I'm not saying that they were identical to European feudalism. They were rarely written into rigid legal codes, and they were often more flexible, more negotiated, and deeply embedded in community life. And I'm thinking of places like Imperial Ethiopia, for example, where land tenure and power relations closely resembled classical feudal structures. In other regions, from the Sahelian empires to Ashanti, the Yoruba, the Bariba, the Buganda, or Zulu kingdoms, one can even go back as old as the pharaohs in Pharaoh, yeah, in Egypt, where you see that authority was centralized, but it was also constrained, right?
Yeah.
Chiefs and kings ruled, but often in consultation with councils of elders, lineages, or religious authorities. For instance, in the Batonou culture, the Ngũgĩ, you see with all of these examples that power was not always absolute.
Yeah. You mentioned Ngũgĩ. I mean, that is, or she is a sister of the king, right?
Yeah, in Bariba culture, yes.
Yeah. And I mean, I think a bit based on what I read, that usually she has a special and powerful position. Maybe a bit similar to what we've seen in the movie Woman King, with, I don't know if you've seen it.
Yeah.
Yeah, with Naniska, which who was played by Viola Davis, in being the kind of an advisor to the king, but in reality, she's kind of the ultimate leader and decision, or de facto decision maker, basically.
Exactly. So all of these, I think, matter because it adds nuance to the debate, right? It challenges the idea that people should not even attempt to rethink democracy. Many of these societies operated through consensus, deliberation, and communal legitimacy, not through, for instance, elections, but also not through unchecked power.
Yeah.
So
I think, that's a very important point, right? It's not unchecked power, and that's why the opposite of democracy is not dictatorship, as was presented in the initial argument. And that's exactly my point earlier. I mean, there are more shades to just dictatorship and democracy in its most common definition. And I was also exactly thinking of the way communities in Africa used to be ruled in the past, basically. I mean, as you exactly described, you would have a system of selection which yields the power to the elders based on their life experience, wisdom, and values. I mean, obviously, this is not a random selection. I mean, it's based on certain criteria. And you would also have a system in place for these elders to discuss, challenge each other, and also achieve consensus before making decisions. So there are certain checks and balances in place. Maybe, I mean, again, it's not a democracy in the Western definition of the concept, but that's not dictatorship either.
Yeah. And of course, I would say all of these systems I just mentioned had serious limits, right? They were often hierarchical and exclusionary in some sense, and they would struggle to govern, I would say, the kind of complex, large-scale societies we live in today. And I'm not an expert on these systems, so I think I won't go much deeper here, but the point simply is Africa's political history is far more complex than a binary opposition between democracy and, I don't know, dictatorship.
Yeah, and exactly. And here again, to borrow Ngũgĩ wa Thiong'o's words, and by the way, check our last episode about his book. Maybe we should decolonize our minds and stop thinking about democracy in its Western form as the only possibility for an equitable and fair governance system.
Yeah, and in fact, I believe that the way forward lies somewhere in between, in a convergence. Democratic principles may well be universal, but the systems that embody them should be open to adaptation, experimentation, and improvement.
Exactly.
Yeah, and personally, I'm not very comfortable with sticking rigidly to the classic You call it Western definition, but I call it classic fixed definition of democracy.
Yeah.
There should be room to rethink it, to refine it, and to make it work better for the realities Africans are facing today. And I think that's, this aspect of the debate that he's kind of missing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there is certainly, I would say, more to unpack here. And but I also don't want to oversimplify his work. However, I do think his arguments could have benefited from more nuance here. So with that in mind, let's shift gears and move on to the next chapter. So the second chapter, he opens the second chapter by turning to what he describes as something that has become another powerful myth. Even though, as I said earlier, this chapter is really about what he calls denial of democracy, a certain denial of democracy in Africa. So the myth, according to him, is Pan-Africanism, and more specifically, the idea that the United States of Africa would somehow solve all of the continent's problems.
Yeah, Axelle Kabou wouldn't like that.
Yeah. So Ndiaye argues here that this vision. Why do you say that Axelle Kabou wouldn't like that?
So yeah, basically, I mean, that's what we discussed in our episode about her book. That I think for her, she sees a United States of Africa as the ultimate goal, and that's what the African leaders should be working towards. And in her book, she was basically criticizing them for not creating more unity in Africa. So that's why I'm saying she wouldn't like this argument.
Yeah, this of creating it wouldn't solve.
It's not gonna solve the problem. Yeah,
exactly. So he argues that this vision has become also a myth, largely because there is very little substantive debate around Pan-Africanism today. Only easy slogans, and I think in that sense he's kind of right. Simplified arguments and what he calls a deep conceptual laziness among some of its current proponents. According to him, this has led to a troubling shift, which is Pan-Africanism as a movement that was originally born as a refusal of domination is in some cases now being used to justify. He used the French word liberticide exercises. Like Pan-Africanism is being used to justify the erosion of freedoms. He gives the example of figures like, again, Kemi Siba and Nathalie Yam, who are now often presented as leading voices of Pan-Africanism, despite, in his view, offering little in terms of serious ideological reflection. And instead, he argues they openly support unlawful takeovers of power across the continent. And also in this section, he tries to expose what he sees as the techniques or the inconsistencies and contradictions in the discourse of these activists.
Yeah. Actually, it sounds to me that he's not criticizing Pan-Africanism in its core as a fundamental idea, but kind of this more recent folkloric, I would say, representation of it. I mean, you mentioned Nathalie Yam and Kemi Seba. I don't know Nathalie Yam, but I've seen some videos of Kemi Seba, and I totally understand the author's point of view here. I mean, and I agree for his or with his critique, because for me, Kemi Seba is a social media figure, basically. I mean, it's mainly about the talking, if you want, around.
Well, he writes books as well.
Okay, yeah, fine. And yeah, it's as I said, it's more folkloric, and basically it's more about populism, as the author said also in the previous chapter. The core of Pan-Africanism, in my opinion, is a bit deeper, or is more deeper than that. So for me, who I would see as the real Pan-Africanists are, for example, the entrepreneurs who are doing business across the continent despite the challenges, or those who are working on removing the trade barriers and facilitating cross-African trade, or the artists and writers who produce for a Pan-African audience. So for me, these are the doers who are really working, who are really embodying the values of Pan-Africanism.
Yeah, you're right. And this is also the part where he includes a rather bizarre open letter addressed to a certain Aminata Dramane Traoré. I don't know who that lady is, but I think she's someone he says he once admired deeply for her fight against domination and oppression, but whom he now criticizes for supporting the military junta in her country. And I'll be honest here, I'm not entirely sure what to make of this part of the book. I found it somewhat unsettling and a bit strange in tone, especially compared to the rest of the chapter. But anyway, I just wanted to mention this open letter that you will read if you buy the book.
Maybe he has some personal matters that he wants to clarify through the book. I don't know.
But yeah, so in the final section of this second chapter, Ndiaye turns to the case of a country that I will not name here. He explains that he spent some time in that country when revolution took place, and he genuinely believed in what many described at the time as the democratic dream of country X. He appears to be very familiar with the country and carefully retraces how democratic ideals, in his view, began to slowly erode over time in that country. And I think it's a very interesting part of the book. What I personally found particularly thought-provoking, however, is that he does not fully engage with the fact that the political situation he describes also resulted from democratic principles, or at least I would say partly due to a democratic process. And in this case, I mean elections. So, and this is, I think, where, again, I had the feeling of an unfinished exercise. If one argues that democracy is universal and generally beneficial for civil liberties, freedom of speech, and political participation, and then presents a case study where the democratic trajectory did not unfold as expected, it seems important to also acknowledge that this outcome is at least in part connected to a certain democratic process that took place.
Yeah.
See? Including, in this case, choices made through elections. So, I don't know. I might sound a bit abstract here because I'm not mentioning the country. But yes, I'm not trying to draw conclusions. Rather, I think this is one of those moments where the complexity of democracy becomes most visible, and where his analysis could perhaps have gone a bit further. But yeah, let me not get too political here. The country is a beautiful country with a rich history, culture, and people.
Yeah, and hopefully the author will take the opportunity to write a second book to dig deeper a bit on his arguments. Maybe.
How do you explain that democratic principle or a democratic process leads to something that is
not necessarily aligned with the democratic values or principles? Yeah.
Now, let's move on to the third chapter, which is also the final. I think there was a conclusion, but last chapter was the third one. And this is the chapter dedicated to what Ousmane Ndiaye calls the Peril. This is also, I would say, an interesting chapter where he first argues that turning to military power, often under the pretext that or the pretext of fighting terrorism after civilian authorities are perceived to have failed to combat terrorism. He says that this is in itself a deeply perilous path. Yeah. One of his central arguments is that many of the problems commonly associated with civilian administrations also exist within military elites, and I think he's right. He refers here to issues such as corruption, poor governance, complacency, and lack of accountability. So, in other words, what he says is that replacing civilian rule with military rule does not automatically resolve these structural problems.
And yeah, as we said in the beginning, this is a link to the recent events that are happening in West Africa, mainly the coup in Guinea-Bissau and the gladly failed coup in Benin.
Yeah. So he illustrates these points with a striking example from one of the Sahelian countries, where he reports on an audit of a national army conducted by a former French high-ranking military official, which revealed serious cases of mismanagement, corruption, and even the theft of public equipment such as vehicles and stuff. So the audit report also discusses how cooperation with Western armies can at times exacerbate these issues, pointing to the sale or transfer of outdated equipments, the accumulation of military hardware from multiple countries, and the lack of adequate training to use and maintain these equipments properly. And he says all of the audits concludes that all of these can weaken rather than strengthen military effectiveness in those countries.
Yeah, I think it's a logical argument, right? I mean, nothing guarantees that a military government is less corrupted or more efficient than a civil one.
Yeah. And then he moves on to more provocative territory, including reflections on the state of civil liberties during the rule of the widely revered Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso.
Oh, wow, he dares.
Which I think is bold.
Yeah.
And in these sections, he also draws on the work and public positions of Axelle Mbembe, who is a Cameroonian philosopher and political theorist. And Ndiaye is kind of gently critical of Axelle Mbembe, at least compared to how he dealt with the Alain Foucault case. This one was gentle, but still I think it was a critic.
Yeah.
he criticized what he describes as Mbembe's brief rapprochement with the French president, especially given that Achille Mbembe had long been one of his most vocal critics.
Is it the current French president?
Yes,
Oh,
the
okay.
current French president. And it's worth noting that Achille Mbembe is a highly respected intellectual figure in Francophone Africa and well beyond. He was awarded the Holbeck Prize last year. The Holbeck Prize is often described as the equivalent of a Nobel Prize in the social sciences.
Yeah.
And more recently this year, he received the Spinoza Prize, which is the most prestigious philosophy award in the Netherlands. I don't want to talk about his work, but this is someone who does serious work.
And widely recognized globally
Yes.
as well. Yeah.
So personally, I wasn't entirely sure what to make of this critique, because one could also interpret Mbembe's position, or his change in position, as an attempt to engage pragmatically, to be part of the solution rather than remaining solely in a posture of critic.
And the opposition.
Yeah. So, again, I won't go into the details here, but I think if this part interests you, I would really encourage you to read the book yourself. And there is much more to unpack in this chapter or in the book, but I will stop here so as not to spoil the book, especially the points he raises about Western double standards on these issues, like military power condemned somewhere and condoned in other places, including within the media, sometimes even among his own colleagues. It's a borderline of critic, and one that deserves to be read and engaged with directly. I think I truly hope that his book will be translated into English.
Yeah. And so we close our journey through Africa Against Democracy: Myth, Denial, and Peril by Ousmane Ndiaye. A timely and provocative essay that challenges the way democracy is debated in Africa, while cautioning against questioning democratic principles themselves or attempting to reinvent a version of democracy tailored for African realities. If this story sparked something in you, pass it on, just like oral tradition. You've been listening to Threads of Africa with Ramdan and Hajar. A bientôt, and stay curious.